But welcome to everyone. My name is Clay Odom, Associate Professor in the School of Architecture and Co-Chair of the Lectures and Exhibitions Committee here at the school. And I'm really thrilled to welcome Kibwe Tavares to the School of Architecture. Kibwe Tavares is a graduate of the UCL, the Bartlett School of Architecture in London, and is founding member of Factory 15, a design-led creative studio that uses animation, visual effects, and emerging technologies to understand and explain the built environment. With work that spans narrative film, advertising, and architectural projects, Factory 15 has worked with high-profile brands, including Formula One, Samsung, Film 4, the British Film Institute, to name but a few. Kibwe has also been named one of the 100 most creative people in business by Fast Company. And in addition to lectures and academic venues like this, he's also spoken at events like TED London and things like that, which is great. Kibwe combines his training as an architect with his love of storytelling and animation to create futuristic 3D animated and live action films with social and political depth, building intricately detailed worlds characterized by their vivid and kinetic visual environments. A thesis project for his master's degree at the Bartlett, his short film Robots of Brixton, which I'm sure we'll see pieces of today if you haven't seen it before, which you should, was awarded the Sundance Film Festival Special Jury Award and the 2011 Royal Institute of British Architects President's Medal. What a combination of honors. I was really interested in bringing Kibwe to the school because he represents the most recent generation of architects who embrace and expand upon the power of architectural education and thinking to explore mediums that transcend traditional building. He has used his architectural training as a platform from which to develop projects and films which critically engage the cultural moment we're in right now. Beautifully constructed, certainly futuristic, visually expansive, and technologically driven, the work tells us stories. It shows us a place where AI and robots exists, but rather than cold projections, this is a place where they can be vindictive and careless, show empathy, or fall in love. In my estimation, like much of the best works of science fiction, the work exists in a continuum between the optimistic and the cautionary, but at its core, it is humanistic. Fundamentally, Kibwe's films and work, Factory 15, are cool and beautiful fictions that interrogate human relations and the complex relations we all have with the contemporary technological worlds and cultures we're simultaneously creating and navigating in real time. Thanks, Kibwe, for joining us, and welcome to the School of Architecture.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, everyone. I've got a presentation. Like I thought, because I know a lot of you are kind of our students are going on your journey. So my presentation really focuses on essentially kind of my journey into kind of like filmmaking and my journey kind of through the Bartlett and to kind of take you into some examples and to show you process really. So if you guys are ready, I'm going to jump into it. Let me share my screen. Sorry. Is everything up? Clay, if you just give me a shout to say everything's working. So basically, like, I sort of spend a lot of time, sort of like, I've got this talk and I think it's called Uncertainty because I spend a lot of time trying to work out what I wanted to do. And I've gone on a kind of big journey through architecture, through animation, like through lots of different things. And now sort of wound up and I'm working as a director in kind of film and animation. I've got Factory 15, and as Clay sort of described, we kind of like, we make a lot of different type of work, a lot of work that kind of explores the built environment, but also kind of very humanistic and kind of is about kind of feeling, it is about kind of humanizing. So this talk really kind of charts that journey kind of through kind of like some of my initial work through it into kind of like into my kind of work now as a filmmaker, also looking at kind of the range of stuff and also focusing really on kind of my process and how the same process applies from when I was designing buildings to kind of making films and animations. But it's all about uncertainty. So I've gone on this kind of journey looking big, like spending a lot of time as an animator. My first love was sort of animation and kind of video games. I trained as an architectural engineer. That was my first undergraduate degree. Then I spent time working as an architect and then went into kind of like working as an architect, I spent a lot of time kind of like photographing, amateur photography, like travel photography, that sort of stuff. And then time as an artist, which is what I consider my time at the Bartlett to sort of be, then landing on becoming a filmmaker. So let me start with animation. So basically my story here is when I was much younger, my dad, I loved computer games, I loved animation, and my dad got me a kind of like a cracked copy of 3D Studio Max. And I taught myself, I used to have these big books and I taught myself character animation. I used to make these kind of like, these quite kind of crude animation, but I think I made this when I was probably 14, 15. This is an example of just one of the things I was really into. And like I played around and used everything I was into at the time. I was watching The Matrix, I was playing Street Fighter, and I was into kind of Ronnie Sides, who is, sorry, one sec, I just need to make sure I've got the sound shed. One sec, I'll go back.
Something of a different pace, fresh into 97 made pace. Now I believe the time is right. How? Stepping from the left to the right, so get ready for the rhythm in check, direct. Believe me, you ain't heard nothing yet. I will volunteer my lyrical skill until the school reaches 50. Oh, you get.
And that was just like a clip of what I made when I probably made that like over 20 years ago now. And I was like, I was a self-taught animator, and I learned how to kind of use the software in that sense. But then when it came to sort of like picking my degree and like choosing what I was going to do, my dad, I'm from immigrant family. My dad was like, you need to do something proper, do something serious. And so he was like, look, you're good at art and you're good at maths. You should do architectural engineering, because that sort of makes sense. And I was like, okay, cool, that sort of makes sense. I wasn't fully sold on architecture just yet. So I went and I studied architecture and engineering at Leeds University. And it's a very cool course, but really I essentially carried on using the 3D tools and the 3D software that I've been kind of making these characters and kind of making these video games with, but to kind of design buildings. And that felt quite straightforward because buildings in general kind of more simple than like character designs. And really, I honed my skills. And this is a 3D model I created. And I kind of like started to kind of train and hone my skills in model making, and as well as in 3D model making. And it's just kind of keep developing. But the main sort of skill I learned from, and I use the kind of 3D models to kind of articulate my ideas, as well as sort of test architectural ideas, as well as test things like structural integrity. But I still continue to kind of develop my 3D skills as a way of communicating ideas, but I also learned how to kind of draw technically and also communicate my ideas that way. So I started to kind of learn how to kind of break. And the key thing I really learned from that project, because you had these massive projects. Our final year project was designing an airport. So you had these massive projects where you had to kind of break things down into the kind of smaller components and smaller things. And that's the sort of a key thing, because I sort of feel that like everything is sort of like everything's made of like tiny bits. Like a film is made of tiny bits, a build is made of tiny bits, sort of like put together in a way that feels like coherent. And so I learned how to kind of like draw, learn how to communicate those ideas, learn how to kind of break things down into kind of smaller bits. And these are some of the kind of technical drawings I was learning and learned how to kind of do it at that course. But then also I still continue to use the 3D to kind of explain my ideas and hone and develop and visualize really. So I would also kind of like, as well as making models, I'd visualize what my building looked like, which led me to kind of like the next sort of chapter of my story, which was, after that, I was much more interested in the design side of things than I was the sort of like the kind of engineering side of things. So I said, look, I want to kind of go into kind of architecture. I want to become an architect. So then I used my portfolio to kind of get a job, and I worked for an architect called Hamilton's Architect. And at the point, I joined on a competition project, which was a concert hall. And it was a really cool project in like Wales, and it was like a kind of renovation of a music and drama school. And they were building a concert hall with a courtyard theatre and sort of like other ancillary spaces like rehearsal rooms and that sort of thing. And like I could have came on the ground floor, worked on the competition team, and again they sort of used my illustration and my 3D skills to kind of help win the competition. And then it's also like, because I could draw very quickly and illustrate and kind of model very quickly, I became like the kind of like a really good, useful design tool for the kind of lead architect in the job. And we kind of played with a lot of ideas. We've done played with a lot of things, and we won the competition. And then my focus actually became on, my focus sort of landed on sort of like working on this concert hall. and designing. And it was basically like designing a kind of like very specific instrument, like a musical instrument. There's so many rules about kind of how the ceiling had to work, how the walls had to work, and how the paneling on the thing had to work. So again, my 3D skills sort of came in useful, sort of like designing a sketch in this space. And it went from like, you know, kind of using it for visuals as well as sort of using it to kind of break down and look at the sections. And this is one of my proudest drawings actually, because we had this kind of like complex ceiling that we needed, and that was curving this way, curving all in all different directions. And I had to sort of like rationalize it and kind of work out how we kind of like turn it into kind of 16 or 20 sort of like similar parts to try and sort of save money. So it's sort of like kind of hark back to the idea of just breaking things down into kind of smaller bits. And sort of like I broke the ceiling down in a 3D form into all these different bits. And then looked at like the sections and then like again like used it for visuals. And then this was the final sort of built thing, which was actually relatively close to the model, and I was sort of creating it. But it was a very sort of fluid process. I spent sort of a couple of years working on that building from start to from competition to it actually kind of like getting built on site. And these were just some of the drawings. And then the cool thing about like architectural education was then, because one is quite long, but two, you get these really long summers. And what I would do is I would spend a bit of time sort of like working freelance, visualizing, maybe a couple of months in the summer. And then I'll try and go on a big trip and I'll take photographs. And the reason I'm showing this because it feels like a big part of my, so I'll take a lot of photographs from trips. I'll travel around Asia, travel around Africa, travel around Europe. And these are just some of the, like the photos I was taking of all these different places. So every year I managed to kind of go on like a big long trip, which sort of started to kind of influence how I'd approach filmmaking and the stories I was interested in telling. And I sort of like got into photography, and I sort of see myself as someone who's kind of like got a skill set and a base in lots of things, but like there's always people that are kind of much stronger, much better. And I think filmmaking is just combining all of these things together. And these are just some of the stills from some of these trips. And then I joined the Bartlett, and so the Bartlett was sort of like a massive sort of like life-changing experience for me in terms of like I joined it, and like so the Bartlett, the setup they've got there, they've got all these different studios, and each studio has a different way of working. It's got a different sort of methodology. Like some are like all like line drawing and hand drawings. Some are like kind of like model making studios. Some are like kind of done like robotics and kind of like quite mechanical based stuff. But the unit I joined was the film unit, and we were, so basically what I loved about it was it allowed me to kind of go back to some of the early animation stuff I was doing as a kid, but it was still under the guise of architecture. So it sort of like satisfied both me as well as my parents, who were kind of like, we want you to kind of make sure you're kind of following like some form of traditional path. And my tutor at the time was a guy called Nick Clay, who I like, he was kind of, it was a kind of very kind of creative, very open people. We had my unit was unit 15. And that became sort of the basis for our studio Factory 15. And we had these kind of quite big, lofty titles. Like, for example, my final piece was, my tutor said, like, I want you guys to kind of make a piece about uncertainty. And I was like, I had lots of questions about kind of identity, about kind of like being Black and British. And as I was sort of getting further into my architectural education, I sort of started to sort of feel myself like move away from my roots in a way. And I sort of wanted to explore that in the form of some sort of like film. And my tutor was like, this is your last chance to kind of be creative, your last chance to kind of do something before after that, you're going to kind of go and you're going to get a job back as an architect, you're going to be working on door schedules, window schedules. So like kind of like use this as a chance to kind of explore whatever you want to do. So I wanted to talk about race, I wanted to talk about culture, I wanted to talk about immigration. So I made a film called Robots of Brixton. And this was because in Brixton is quite a kind of transient area that's had lots of different cultures, lots of different people have moved through changing areas. And I was really interested in the idea of layering, the idea that each kind of race or each kind of like culture that comes through kind of like kind of puts their own sort of like stamp on the place. And I said, but I had to kind of come up with a design project that kind of like allowed me to kind of like design something. So initially kind of started as like, I wanted to sort of like re-look at Brixton as if it was kind of like designed by robots. And it started as like an exploration of redesigning Brixton. And then as I sort of like kind of moved into the idea, I thought, actually, look, I want to sort of like have some form of story within this because I want to connect with people. So I said, let me look at something. And I looked at the Brixton riots, which were race riots that happened in the 80s. When, you know, there's a lot of kind of things going on, like kind of inequality in housing, inequality in like healthcare, inequality, all these sorts of things. And they end up in these quite explosive riots in the 80s. And so I wanted to kind of retell that story, but through the lens of robots being, because I wanted to kind of abstract it to a certain degree. And so I made a short film called Ropes of Brixton. I'll play that for you now. I've also got it as a link because I don't know how smooth it's going to play, but I'll try and play it and then see. And then I'll take you through the process of making it, and also then what happened after.
The police are being pelted with petrol bombs, bricks and bottles. In return, they drum their truncheons on their riots. Thick black smoke from blazing houses
based on law and order first, and also it's enough to convince me that the thief has in their business, and I want to say this again.
Well, of course there's an awful lot of looting, but don't look at the police, look at the looters. You need an awful lot of policemen to look after 800 marauding young blacks.
They make the ruler them understand that we not take no more of them oppression. And when we check out the ghetto grapevine, every rebel just a rebel in them story. Them a talk about the power and the glory. Them a talk about the burning and the looting. Them a talk about the smashing and the grabbing. Them a tell me about the vanquish and the victory. Them said the Babylon them went too far.
don't know how well that played, but there's a link there. So basically that film sort of like completely changed my life, really. I didn't really know how much it, like now looking back on it, I made that, I think it took about 6-7 months, and it's just me, I've done everything apart from the music, doing the animation, doing all of the design. I'm going to take you through the process of doing that. It sort of changed, you know, like it kind of went out online and made a bit of a splash, and it sort of changed everything. And also like now looking back on it, I sort of see that this was sort of like me defining and me learning my process as a filmmaker. And so it sort of became this kind of like, it sort of like changed my kind of like my life in a sense that like it opened up opportunities, which I'll sort of go into and talk through later. So I'll talk you through the process now. So basically I start, and each time I sort of start with this process of kind of making collages. And what I found at the Bartlett, which I really enjoyed, was I was a lot freer for me. So I could kind of be like, I felt I could be much more creative. So this was my first sort of like collage of like redesigning Brixton. As I was saying, this is like a famous housing estate in Brixton. I was like, what does it look like if the robots moved in and kind of make it their own? And so I made this kind of collage of that. And then I also like looked at the whole high street and looked at things like what the bus is going to look like. So my sort of first sort of like foray into kind of like world building. I've sort of wanted this kind of like cobbled together stuff. The idea that like, you know, immigrants, when they come, they sort of like change and adapt what's there rather than kind of like wipe and you get like a clean slate. You know, when you sort of see a futuristic city in a sci-fi movie and the city's got no history in it, like it's not, I mean, it's not really like there's so much history within the kind of like within the present. And within the future too. So I've done these as a series of like collages. Then I started to kind of look at the robots and look at like some of the scenes. And this is like one of the stills from the start of the film that you just saw. As well as sort of like some of the sort of like collages, we also looked at like interior spaces and like I kind of remodeled and remade kind of like 3D sets that I could then use as like fully digital environments. So I could kind of put the camera and move around whatever I want. And this was like one of the key frames from when the window smashes towards the end of the film. And then when we sort of setting out, I was sort of like looking, as I started on the design process with Brixton, I sort of went around, I just took a whole bunch of photographs around Brixton, so to sort of build up what the world was, as you can sort of see here, kind of like, and this now for me, like my location scouting, this process I do all the time when I'm making films. And that was the first time I started to kind of use the technique of merging filming with 3D. And so I wanted to kind of film different. I didn't know how I was going to film, so I learned how to use it like one of those like mini kind of like magic Steadicam things. And I shot like all loads of different plates around Brixton. And so this is my first sort of time doing that. I learned how to kind of camera track, so I could track the movement and put it into kind of 3D. And that was such a big, significant sort of like technological change in my process, because then it allowed me to kind of, instead of making everything in CG, which I've done before, this is my first time actually allowed to kind of use a plate or use a, and that's defined sort of my style from then and in. I sort of like, I planned everything. I sort of chose where I was going to shoot. And this is where sort of the engineer and the kind of producer in me came in. Like, I made the schedule probably about the first 2 months into the project. This is like Monday, this is like February. And so sort of like, once I sort of done the initial kind of planning bit, the original sort of like, I then sort of made an animated previs, and then I sort of planned the 6 months rigorously, because I had so much work to do. I had to kind of be super strict with myself and kind of give myself really clear deadlines, which I guess the same as like, you know, any project, everyone will sort of understand that, but I had to kind of break it down into the sequences I was in. And these are some kind of stills from my animated previs. So basically it's kind of like just kind of screenshots. So I basically like made a very crude version of the animation before making it, to give a sense of, so I knew exactly how much I needed to make, as well as to give a sense of the kind of pacing, the editing, the music. So all of those films, basically developing the film like constant and not just dropping in shots when they were ready. And it was like an ongoing kind of a continual process of like editing and trimming down. And then so the first sequence was all about kind of establishing Brixton. And this is like a key frame from that sequence outside. So Brixton's got this kind of like famous town hall. And then to see like robots there it's like, I guess, relatively iconic was the idea. And this is what the image was, but this is everything that I made in the kind of 3D or whether it's 3D or projected onto it. And so this page here sort of shows like process work. So on the top right, you've got the original kind of plate that I start to work with. And then if you look over here, all the kind of different passes. So you've got your kind of like, you've got all the model that I can see that's made on top. Then you've got your kind of render passes. And then all of these sort of combine to kind of like get to the final image, which is at the bottom right. And then this was my compositions. I used to use After Effects at this point, but then now I kind of used to kind of more towards using Uke. Even though I'm not on the tools as much as I used to be, but this was also me kind of learning how to composite and just learn how to kind of stitch everything together, but all based from the original collages. And then I've got this is one of the 3D sets. So in the film, when you go into the kind of robot bar, I also had kind of completely digital 3D spaces. And this was based on like a bar in Brixton called the Dog Side. It's got this really small entrance to the Dog Side. Then it suddenly expands and kind of comes to a much bigger space. And here, like, it was much more comfortable with it because I was used to sort of like just create 3D environments and put the camera wherever I wanted to. And you can sort of see where all the cameras are within the space. And then I've got these drawings, which are kind of exploded accents and stuff. And these images are sort of made, you know, when you're sort of like filling your portfolio, you're sort of like, you've done all the work, but you need to kind of bolster. So you kind of like explode your drawing so it looks like you've done more work than you have. And then the third sequence of this space, I went to kind of like design this space within the film that allowed, so it's sort of like a dream space for the robots. It's like a place where the robots could kind of go in their kind of dreams and in their space. And I wanted it to kind of feel like much more natural. And I had references to kind of like Piranesi and David Friedrich and all these sort of architecture references that were different to, they had to be kind of very different to the kind of the Browns and the kind of like the sort of like, I can't find the word, the sort of like gritty sort of feeling. I wanted to kind of feel very, very different. So I had these kind of references from Piranesi and his natural. And then I sort of made this kind of 3D space through kind of like pulling and stretching all these different bits, which became the base. And then I sort of layered on top of it, like some of the greenery and some of the growing. And this is sort of a wireframe from that image and what the kind of fine look of the space was. And then we had the kind of the riot scene, which I felt was the most powerful scene within the story. And this is when I wanted to kind of like pay special attention to kind of what had happened before. And I think I recently watched, there's a film called The Waltz with Bashir. And at the end of that animation, they cut to kind of real life footage. And I felt it was kind of very, very effective, very, very powerful. So I wanted to kind of like make sure that it wasn't just this kind of thing, which was just about these robots. And actually it was about something real. So then I made this a whole series of collages remaking these famous photographs. In the bottom right of the picture, you can see the famous photograph from the riots, but remaking them but in my world and with my robots and with my designs. And so I've done a whole series of these collages. Again, like some of the original picture and then kind of remaking them into kind of what. And then we had these things called a chronogram, which was basically, we wanted to make these things with just one image that kind of shows, if you gave this image to someone, the idea was that they could kind of take it and make the sequence of your film. But I sort of like wanted to sort of try and tell that story of riots within this sort of sequence. So it started as like, you know, the police kind of coming out, chasing people, running away, being really, really scared. Then people confronting the police, turning over cars and having a big standoff. And then that kind of coming like a kind of destruction and aftermath. So I sort of like kind of made a collage of this one sequence. I wanted to do it in like one sort of like shot. And then I turned that collage into, from the collage of the kind of the original sort of archive photos into a collage in my world that I designed. And then I turned that collage and I broke that collage down and turned it into 3D. So I then sort of like made the collage in a kind of 3D environment and then kind of planned the camera route and kind of like, you can sort of see the camera route kind of like going through the different spaces, which sort of ends up landing on the archive photo. And alongside this, I got in trouble at one point because I was spending a lot of time designing and making these robots because I like, this is still architecture because you have to kind of like, so, but you know, everything in that thing was designed and then, so these are just some of the kind of the robots and just some of the pieces. So I sort of like really, and these are some of my portfolio pages and some of the concept sketches we used for some of the alternate robots within. And as I was saying, that sort of like changed everything for me. It's sort of like, it won the kind of RBA Silver Medal. It was also won a prize at Sundance and sort of opened the doors for kind of me becoming and working my way into film. And so after that, so these are kind of two stills from both of those things. So after that, we also like me and my two others, a guy called Jonathan Gales and Paul Nichols from my studio in the Bartlett. We decided, look, let's kind of like, we really want to kind of keep making these weird short films. And how do we do that? We don't really know how the film industry works. We don't know how all of this stuff kind of like falls and all this stuff kind of works out together. So let's kind of like form a company. We called the company Factory 15 basically, we took the 15 from our studio, but we used the word factory because we felt like our work ethic was quite like we're really hard working. We sort of like we just kind of like very rigorous, work really hard. And this is it's from Paul's project. So we basically combined our university projects to kind of have us, and that became our portfolio. So these were two from, this is Paul's project, this is Jonathan's project. And we had basically 3 or 4 short films that said, okay, cool, this is Factory 15. And because we had quite a range of work already, we already had an aesthetic because we've been working so closely together. And that became the basis for our studio, like our short films. And then we were lucky enough to, my old boss as an architect, he sort of gave us a job to kind of like start doing architectural visuals. So we basically like use architectural visual work to start kind of like being like, how do we actually kind of make money as a studio? So, and how do we support ourselves? So we basically, the idea was to kind of use our kind of like architectural visual work to kind of fund our company. And then through that, we'd also kind of do much more creative work. And so over the years, that became a model that we essentially like, it gave us some stability, and then it kind of opened doors to sort of like, you know, and we tried to kind of do the more creative end of architectural visuals, the kind of the more fun, the more kind of like creative side of that sort of work. And it also led to kind of like designing and doing world building for film stuff. So we've also done a sort of like a lot of work where kind of like film companies have come to us and we've designed worlds, designed character design buildings for them. We also kind of got into kind of immersive design and design of immersive spaces. So we've managed to, across the years, we managed to kind of like use our training as architects to sort of like do a range of projects, whether it's working for architects or working for film makers, the film producers, as well as doing our own kind of creative immersive work, and like a massive kind of range of work. And this is just kind of selection of a few of them. Now I'm going to take you to Jonah. So Jonah was the first time I managed to like make work as a filmmaker, as a director, because basically I got approached from Film 4 in the UK, and they said, look, what do you want to do now? And I said, look, if I'm going to leave architecture to become a filmmaker, like I made Rebels of Brixton in my bedroom. In my mind, a filmmaker isn't a director, isn't that? A director is someone who sort of shouts to people on set and tells them what to do. So I didn't really have loads of confidence. I just felt like I was a dude who made something in his bedroom, basically. So I didn't have confidence to call myself a director yet. And then Jonah was the first time that as a company, we were trying to establish our name. So it was our first kind of big creative project. So like we basically my first time to kind of like step away from doing everything to kind of like working with a team, learning how to kind of work with actors, then how to work with writers. And I sort of said, look, if I'm going to step away, I want to really sort of try and make this count. And I had a general meeting with the people at Film 4, and I said, I've recently done a big trip around East Africa and taken a lot of photos. And I said, I want to find a simple story that I really understand and try and kind of do my version of that. So I came with Old Men and the Sea, the Hemingway novel. And I said, okay, cool, that's a simple story as a place to start. And I want to set it in East Africa, because I've done a big trip around East Africa and I know it well. So let me kind of talk to kind of some of my own experience there, but use this as a way in. And we were initially I was going to set in a place called Lamu, because they were going to build this big industrial port there. And so it's kind of this tiny village town in northern Kenya, right on the border with Somalia. It's like this tiny fishing, very traditional fishing town. It's right on the border with Somalia, and there's no cars there. It's just kind of this tiny town, and they're about to kind of build this massive, industrial port, because they've got like a really steep fall off into the water. And I was interested in setting, because I was still kind of in my architectural space. I was interested in the future. I was interested in setting Old Men and the Sea after they've built this port in this kind of tiny town, and what's going to change. I wanted to kind of look at this film across 2 time frames. And I met this guy called Mwaka, who was like a beach boy. He kind of like spent a lot of time with tourists and taking them on trips and stuff. And I kept thinking, okay, he'd be an interesting character because he somehow fits between these 2 worlds of sort of like spending a lot of time with tourists who have seemingly infinite money, as well as kind of this very traditional fishing village, so he kind of didn't fit into either world, basically. So I thought that's an interesting kind of starting point for a character. And I wanted to kind of tell the story of him from his life, young and old. And I met with lots of producers, and this is my first time meeting like producers, writers. And I worked with a writer called Jack Fawn at the time. And we've done lots of things, like we've done all these diagrams, all this kind of way to kind of try and work out the story. And I pitched him my ideas, my way in, and he sort of said, okay, cool, I can turn this into a story in some form. And then he kind of came back with a screenplay. And this is my first time working with a screenplay. And I had to kind of use these diagrams as a way of articulating how I could understand it. So this is Lamb on the top right, and this is the kind of port that we're building. And I've got the trailer for Jonah. Some of you might have seen it, but I'll pay you the trailer too. So, and then I'll kind of go through the process.
I am bored.
You're often bored and Bana.
The same bitchy, the same sound, the same life. We need to build something in this town, no?
You look like a baboon guy. brain is balloon, balloon.
Sorry. So basically, that's just a quick tease of the project. The whole project is like 17 minutes long, and it's online. So it's easy, you just have to Google Jonah short film. So really, that's my kind of like, that's just a tease of it. And the basic premise of the story is about this kid who gets photographed with this kind of giant fish, and then that changes his fortunes. And then from then, this whole kind of world changes around him. And he's like, his town kind of turns to shit, and like he sort of like kind of has this big vendetta about the fish and kind of goes after it. So it's all about kind of like consumerism and tourism, and like this guy sort of being excluded a little bit from and getting kind of separated and pulled out from his hometown. So I'll take you through the process of making that a little bit. So after sort of like getting the commission, I went on a recce. And I took photographs the same way my approach from making Rovers to Brixton. These were some of the pictures I took. We went through kind of loads and loads of iterations on the script. One of the key things that happened was we initially started in Lamu, and then as I sort of showed earlier, but one of the key things that happened was this tourist got kidnapped by locals, and so we couldn't get insurance to shoot there. So we had to kind of move our shoot. And then that kind of like triggered a whole change from the industrial point and me looking at industry in a different way, and me looking at industry in the way of looking at it through the eyes of tourism, as opposed to kind of heavy industry. So we went through loads and loads of different versions of script. And I also wasn't used to working in script. Hadn't really read a script before. Obviously I knew what a script was, but I hadn't read a script or hadn't worked from a script before. And so like I basically like made a kind of very crude animated version of the film, because I knew I could animate. And I didn't know like what bits were working and what bits weren't. So I basically made a kind of like a very crude animatic of the film as a way to test it. And I didn't necessarily know how to kind of shoot a live action film. So I worked out how to kind of shoot my coverage through making this kind of like rough version of it. And we had all these different rethinks of project. And like, I was lucky enough to work with a young Daniel Kaluuya, who I think is going to win his Oscar this year. So we then came with this idea of kind of like trying to parallel the kind of the man with the fish. And this idea of kind of having two different time zones, and him seeing the fish when he's young and the fish is young and all that sort of stuff. And then it was about, the key idea was this whole world's built on this idea of kind of having this world's biggest fish, and Zanzibar turns from being that's kind of this really picturesque, beautiful place into kind of this trashy like tourist town. And these were so I again went into collaging and tried to kind of make my collages of what this world's going to look like. But this time, because I wasn't necessarily working by myself, I had a team. I had Jonah and Paul, who I built the company with. I could kind of give an overview of what I wanted it to look like, but then they could kind of take it to the next level. And so this was the collages that I made, but then they took it to the next level. And we had a lot of fun sort of like playing around with playing around with the brands that are in this world, playing around with like weird stuff that can happen in this world, and playing around with posters, playing around with all the world building, that essentially become like, playing around with all the clutter of the world. And we started to kind of make all of this artwork, which was kind of, I thought was amazing, because it kind of elevated what I could do by myself way beyond. And we made all of these kind of like quite beautiful, quite haunting, quite sad images of what this sort of town becomes like. We've done a whole series like before and after images. So this one after, then before and after. And again, looking at kind of how the signage would change, what this kind of town would become, and before basically town gets spoiled and after. Because there's a big sequence in the film, some of you might have seen it, where you sort of see the kind of town change real time to our eyes. And these again before and after. And we also looked at that in the kind of the form of like looking at underwater, like what that looks like before and what it looks after the change. And again, and we also explored the idea of kind of lots and lots of fish. And this process sort of spoke to the idea of the engineering stuff. When you sort of break down, like, you've got a massive task, you have to break it down into the smaller bits. And even designing the fish, we had lots and lots of different designs of the fish. And then this was the one I like. And these are all drawn by an artist called Warren Holder, who's my cousin. He's like a brilliant illustrator, and I just love his drawings. And so I took his drawing, and like this was the one I loved. And I was like, how do you sort of like turn that into something 3D? Because it's so complicated. And then, but because a lot of the 3D artists didn't know how to make it art, and to actually break it down into kind of plan, section, elevation, and to draw different layers. So he basically drew a plan and a plan section of the fish, and then basically every single layer on top, and then how we kind of got to the bigger fish. So that then so we broke it down into kind of the components so that someone could make it. And then we had all these different drawings, and that the fish, this was the difference. We had a whole bunch of illustrations. The fish kind of worked out pretty well in the end. And then this was looking at kind of like trying to get the weight and trying to get the movement of the fish right. So this is different takes of animation of the fish sort of jumping out of the water. There's a point where the fish jumps out. This first one was too sort of fast. The second one was too fast too. Then we sort of got like the kind of the weight of it and stuff right, so it could feel like a big fish. And then this is the final like comped version. And then this was the first time, like, again, like breaking stuff down and learning how to kind of like basically kind of do the kind of like high-end VFX. And we were like completely blagging it at the time. We didn't really know what we'd do. We knew how to execute the work, but we didn't actually have a kind of proper process. So it was the first time all of us, we learned so much in this. We all kind of flew out to Zanzibar, and on set we were kind of working out how to kind of do stuff, like how to kind of do VFX breakdowns. We had this kind of big, it's like a kind of like 10-day shoot in Zanzibar, and we had a lot of fun, like kind of going around. So this is us like on set. We had these like fruit trucks, so we kind of we drove around the town in on, and we had all the equipment. So my first time working, and we shot underwater as well as above water, and you know, we shot on the beaches and all that sort of stuff. And this is Daniel and Malachi in that chase sequence. And this is a sequence where I'm going to show you sort of one of the breakdowns. So when after my recce, it takes you from the recce footage to kind of my animatic to kind of the final shot, but it kind of shows you how we kind of made some of the VFX and some of the animation. So this is the previs coming up, and this is like me sort of like crudely mocking stuff up and showing how the town's going to change, or saying how the shot's going to change, and me like mocking everything up, saying, look, we want this big shot where all the buildings sort of rise from the sea, basically. And then this is what we shot from the actual kind of main camera, and we just kind of went up and down the road, just kind of shooting from the side of this car that we're driving on, and then we started to kind of layer in the visual effects. So we started to kind of like layering all these different things, you know, posters and kind of stuff of Daniel, of the character on the walls. Even things like the kind of cart he's got on the bike, we sort of done a dummy thing to kind of show how it might move. And then we built the cart, we used photography from the kind of shoot. And all of that we sort of drop in. And so basically this kind of took this idea kind of layer into the next level. So initially I just done it in the collages, and now we're sort of doing it like real time into footage to kind of like to a degree and to a quality that I didn't imagine that we're going to get to it being this good when I started the project. And even things like this kind of big truck at the end. And so I think this is the final shot coming up.
Thousands of tourists are making the trek and heading to the most
So the film's sort of like very, very like full on. It's very kind of rich. And I just want to show you one last thing on this project. I've got one more project, but it's only a short project, and then we can chat. But this is basically like the previs. So on the left, you see like sort of see kind of like what I made to kind of help me like plan the shoot before doing it, and you'll sort of see a comparison with what we actually shot on the right.
Write something.
Am I good for time? I've got one more project I can show quickly, or should we do questions? Clay, if you give me a shout. Let's keep going. So basically, I've got one more project to show. And this, I've got a chance to make a ballet too. So all of that. So Jonah, that's the last thing I had on Jonah, and then all of that stuff is kind of like I got approached because they saw a treatment that I put together for a TV show, and like the Royal Opera House in the UK approached me and said, "Look, Kibwe, we love your films. Would you like to kind of like make a kind of like a ballet on stage?" And it's for me, it's the same thing as like using that process to kind of then apply to kind of something very different. So I had this kind of, I wanted to sort of tell a version of a little matchstick girl. And I had this theatre, which was kind of brand new theatre they just built to kind of like do like a very specific piece of work. And we used this me sort of in rehearsals. And we used a combination of kind of like, it's a combination between film, dance, as well as sort of like live projection. We had this big sort of like projection screen behind the dancers. And this is like a tiny little clip from it that we use to kind of like, sort of like have fun. And these are some stills from the actual show. And then the last thing I'll just play you is a trailer from that, and then I've got time for questions. Cool. Well, that's sort of me. I don't think I explained the ballet very well, but
oh, that's fantastic. I mean, what a really amazing presentation, and such a generous one as well to give us such insight into the projects and your thinking that really yeah, it's fantastic. Thanks so much. I'm sure there are a million questions, but perhaps I can field a few questions, or if you can raise your hand. And Dean Addington has a question.
Oh, I was actually going to say I like to wait until all the students have asked first, so I'll hold off. But let's with any student who has a question.
There's a couple in the chat.
Oh yeah, okay. Here's one from YouTube. Was the music for robots for the robots of Brixton film inspired by trip hop by chance, i.e., artists like Massive Attack, Portishead, etc.?
Not specifically. I think there was a designer I was working called Murad Benitza, who what did he do? He kind of like, we sort of had a kind of whole reference pool that I think naturally probably was inspired by that stuff. And we initially started trying to kind of make like robot versions of like classic reggae songs. And they were just horrible. Because like, you know, Brixton's got like a very kind of like Caribbean heritage around it. So like, we kind of like made remix of things like Toots and the Maytals, but like using like robot sounds. And it's just like, we were just like butchering like these classic songs. So we kind of like then moved away to kind of like create our own. And there is something that kind of is very kind of trip hop and a bit kind of like trippy about some of it, I guess. And then there's two different musicians we work with. One called Mo Benitez and another one called DJ Hiatus. So we definitely influenced by that stuff. That's the song we use at the end.
Fantastic. There are a couple of ones that have come through. I mean, I think you explained this, but can you maybe go into it a little bit more about the inspiration behind this sort of combination of architecture and film, and maybe building on that, like how do you see that moving forward? Because I think the ballet is is another kind of like inflection point.
Yeah. So in terms of like the inspiration was, I was studying architecture, like, so the kind of practical answer is like beyond being trained as an architect. So I was practicing at the Bartlett, and the Bartlett had kind of, you had all these different studios, each one sort of like having different sort of like creative outputs. And the coolest, there were so many different ones. And like, I sort of saw it as a chance to kind of go back to kind of my animation stuff that I started at the very like start, you know, when I was a kid. And I was like really into that. I was really into kind of like, so sort of combining to, it was almost like, it's just because I try and use everything. So like I'd been doing years of training as an architect. So then, and now I was kind of back doing kind of film and animation. So like the inspiration was, it wasn't like I sort of said, let me kind of do architecture and film. It was almost like, it sort of like came from within, it came from like my experience really. So I try and use as much, like I try and use all of my experience when I'm making stuff. And so it really sort of came from sort of like the things I was going through and like the experience I'd gone through in terms of my training.
Yeah. Fantastic. Dean Addington, I think it's to you now.
Okay, I don't normally apologize for asking naive questions. I just go ahead and ask them. But this is a time where I feel like I'm really being a naive here on this. But first of all, I just have to say, I'm totally blown away by this work. I cannot tell you how inspired I am by this and how much I want to change my life right now and get involved in something else. But here's my question, and I guess it was triggered a couple of times during the lecture. First, I think when we're seeing the robots from Brixton, and it's hard not to think about Metropolis, Fritz Lang's Metropolis. And then when you talked about Piranesi and Friedrich, and I think that, for many of us who love dystopian urban futures, those are great touchstones or reference points for us. So if we think about architectural history and we think about sort of the much of what we learn pedagogically in architecture, we have what we consider to be canonical references, whether it's towards a new architecture, all of these sort of different things are our canonic references. For somebody who's operating in this sort of other world as you're operating, are there canonic references in film that we as architects should be paying attention to? I know that we all know the standards, Fritz Lang, Wong Kar-wai, In the Mood for Love, Terry Gilliam, Brazil, we all have that as part of our library, but is there something that you would think that for many of our students would be a canonical library of film that actually could really trigger the kind of thinking that would switch the way that we see the world and interact with the world?
That's a good question. I don't know if I know how to answer that straight off the bat. I think that I don't know if I can answer off the bat like a straight kind of reference. I think that like when I approach stuff, like it's a combination of, when I think of like kind of references for films, it always feels kind of very specific to what I'm doing at that time. So like if the references for Jonah are completely different for, Robots of Brixton, even though like aesthetically, like, and then the reason why they sort of like aesthetically end up feeling kind of similar of the same world is because I'm sort of regurgitating them in the sense that like, I don't like, I think when I was looking at I can talk specifically to say, for example, when I was looking at Jonah, I wanted to kind of like create a film that the environment was its own character. So like I looked at films like, like City of Gold, even films like Slumdog Millionaire, that like were films that like at the time, and they're not like, they were kind of like still like relatively contemporary at the time. But they sort of like allowed me a way in to kind of like, how do I kind of do my version of the way that those films treat their environment? Like say for example, something like City of God, like, kind of like the fellas and like that they all grow up in, like they've taken that whole character within the film, even though they're not a speaking character, like everything happens, it's very specific rules for very specific reasons. And you have to kind of like, and one of the things, you have to kind of like make up the rules or make up the kind of like the container for yourself. So reference is always hard because it's so specific to each project. It's not like I have like a kind of like like a bank of like, okay, cool, these are the go-to. And there are things that like, you know, I knew that I sort of love. Their things, you know, whether it's Fritz Lang, Metropolis, that you're like, okay, cool, they're touchstones, and you sort of like, there's other things, I guess, films like Blow Up. I'm trying to think of like sort of other sort of references that, but I don't have like a kind of overall list of something that like I could say these things are sort of like the go-to to kind of help you start thinking outside. But there's lots of films that so I don't know if I answer your question, sorry. I tried to blag it, but
That was great. That was great. That's actually really interesting. And I think sometimes I think within our field, we might actually be too wedded to a fairly limited set of these reference points.
Yeah.
So I actually like your answer better than the one that I was looking for.
Yeah. And I think that's been for me the coolest thing about like, I guess, my architectural education as a filmmaker now, because I've got like a broader set of references than a lot of other filmmakers, because I've just kind of like had the chance to do lots of different things through kind of having the chance to kind of study architecture, having the time it took, having the chance to kind of do lots and lots of things. So that means that like I can draw, when I'm kind of looking at work, I'm drawing on lots of different things. I'm not just drawing on other films, I'm drawing on like these different like life experience and all these different things that have happened, and these different things I managed to kind of be able to like get a chance to do. And that sort of things allowed me to kind of drift a little bit. Like it's allowed me to kind of have a wealth of experience. And I think the way that I sort of like try and pick the projects that I do now, because you spend a lot of time on them and you give a lot of yourself to them, that like I kind of pick more about the experience I'm going to get from it and what I'm going to learn from it sometimes than the actual kind of final piece. So when they kind of approached me at the ballet, I was like, look, I don't know, and if I don't know much about ballet, but I do know how to work with other people, and I do know how to kind of like set a target and a name at that target. And I was kind of really keen to kind of have the experience of kind of doing a live media as opposed to something that's kind of very much, everything is kind of very set and recorded, and like you have control of everything. Well, like having something that kind of feels is live and immediate, like was kind of a new thing. And there's loads that I learned from that. And I didn't really need to kind of go into it too much because I was sort of like rushed through it, and I only finished it sort of last year. I mean, I haven't necessarily kind of documented all the kind of process of it and stuff yet.
Amazing. Maybe there's a time for one or two more. I had one question. Just what's on the docket next? Like, how are you building out of all of the recent success and all the work that goes into the projects, and what's next for you? And maybe also paired with that is like one other question I have paired with that is how do you see maintaining this very sort of personal kind of approach to making film as the things get bigger and more complex, and I'm sure budgets and things are as well.
I've been learning a lot recently actually, because I've had like quite a kind of like up and down last couple of years. So next, in terms of like last year, like I'm working on, I don't know how much I can talk about the project because they're not sort of like I'm doing an animated project with Netflix, like a fully animated project with Netflix. I've almost gone like full circle back down to kind of like where some of the origins of my work. And I'm also working with I'm working on a fully animated project with Netflix, as well as a feature that I've been working on for years that I've been trying to develop and get going. And now all of those things are all happening at once, and I'm sort of negotiating that. And then how do I kind of keep it very personal? It's hard because as it gets bigger, like what I've had to learn really, because I was so used to sort of doing everything, and Jonah was the first time that like I got a chance to kind of work with a bigger team. And over the years, as I started to kind of do more projects, I was starting to kind of learn to kind of let go a little bit. But then I have to learn how to kind of communicate my ideas in a different way. And actually that was the hardest thing about Jonah, because I was so used to sort of just doing everything by myself. And it's like, the only challenge was how much can you do by yourself in the time you've got, and then how good can you make it? And then suddenly I was then in the world of like, okay, cool, I need to communicate to these people who are actually much better than me, these specific jobs. So how do I kind of do that? And I found ways, and I found kind of ways to kind of compensate and ways to kind of communicate. And that was really hard, because it's like, that was kind of new. Do you see what I mean? Because when it's just you, it's like, but then like once I sort of realized actually the kind of possibilities go beyond what I can, like they can go far beyond what I can do by myself. I'm so much less limited by being able to kind of communicate. And like that was a challenge at first though, because I was working with so many different types of people too, whether it's working with an actor, working with a grip, or working with a camera person. So there's kind of the range of how to kind of communicate to people became the new sort of thing I had to learn. And I've been sort of like learning that progressively over like, it's been sort of, maybe it was 10 years ago now. So it's been a while, and I've sort of like been like kind of like building up, and like the teams and stuff I've working at have been getting like a lot bigger. And I've sort of like been like fielding that and kind of working out how to communicate my ideas through anyway. And that's been sort of like the biggest like learning curve for me as well, because it's become much less about how much I do myself. In recent years in particular. Anyway, yeah, I hope that answers that.
Yeah, completely. Do you have time for, I think there's one more question.
I've got time, yeah, I'm fine for time.
Great, thank you. Lolita.
Yes, hi, thank you, Clay. Hi, Kibwe, this was so amazing, just lovely. I'm dying to teach robots of Brixton with District 9. So I thought that would be just such an interesting way. And I love the way in which you do animation. I was actually very impressed with the scale, that kind of wide scale that you've got. It looks like a panorama with those, when you've got a compositing of several photographs that you did.
Yeah.
That was so impressive. And my question over here, because you're moving into VFX, etc. I was wondering whether you would edge towards doing VR work or VR film, because it looks like that seems like the next, or at least a sideways way of thinking about it. But I think the question from Dean Addington about architecture and film, for me, I'm a film person, so for me architecture is like the greatest friend. So and I thought of VR work as that kin between these two digital programs, right? When the affordances of architecture seem to be so available in such a deeply immersive film possibility, film in a very loose way, right? In this VR work,
so in terms of VR stuff, so my company Factory 15, like me personally, like I really enjoy it, but I haven't quite yet worked out how I translate the work into kind of VR film. And I think mainly because of a lot of the storytelling happens in the editing, and editing in VR films quite difficult, because you can't, if you're immersed in something, you can't kind of chop and change or cut as easily as you can, like a kind of, when I'm saying, look, I want you to kind of like pay attention to this, I want you to watch this. But we've done a lot of work as a company, kind of like immersive experiences and experiential stuff, where we kind of created like environments that you can go and get lost in. And I think I only had one still from a project we had called Cocoon, which was a big sort of like a big dome project, which is a big digital dome, and it's a big projection thing that we effectively made a space, and the dome sort of like transformed and kind of tweaked and like changed around you as you're sort of going through it. And as an experience, it's kind of a very cool thing in it, but it's kind of like, me personally, I haven't quite worked out necessarily yet how to, storytelling wise, how to kind of use that beyond kind of like creating a space and creating an environment around you. But we have, as a company, and Paul Nichols, my business partner, he's kind of championed that within our company. We've done lots of like cool stuff and lots of projection based stuff. So some of it's on our website, you can sort of like explore and look at. But I'm interested, I just haven't worked out how to kind of sort of like weave a narrative through, and also I've been sort of like, and I think, sorry, going back to the ballet, because I only sort of flash through that. We sort of done that a little bit in that, because we had this kind of big immersive screen that wrapped around the dancers, and then basically, like, if you're sitting in the space, it's almost felt like if you're in the middle of the auditorium, almost like the auditorium wrapped around you, and then the screen wrapped around, so you felt like a cocoon, like tied into this kind of environment. So we tried to do it through that as a live event, and for some things it sort of worked, some things didn't quite work as well as we had hoped for, but I would like to kind of retry that and do something live again in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kibwe, for the phenomenal lecture, inspiring lecture, thrilling work, and just the general generosity of being able to show all of the backstory behind it. I think that's really what makes it even more special. Thank you so very much. And I look forward to chatting with you more and seeing the work as it evolves in the coming years. It's going to be an exciting time.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that.
And thanks to everybody who's joined us today. And we'll see you soon.